leaving Islam was very difficult. Imagine just believing something that you know is the truth all your life, only for you to find out that it's completely false and made up and just stands on pillars of sand. And when I say believe, I mean like the sky is blue, you believe the sky is blue, and then one day you're told and proven that it's in fact not blue. That's how hard it was for me when I discovered that Islam was false. However, as hard as that was, it pales into comparison as to what I went through after October 7th.
He was born and raised in the United States, but his family comes from Samaria, what the world today calls the West Bank. He grew up in a Palestinian Muslim home, taught to defend Islam and chant Free Palestine without question. He believed it completely until he started asking questions and everything began to fall apart. Today, he's speaking out, completely anonymously, because what he has to say could put him in danger. We don't know his name, we won't see his face, we only know him as the Saved Samaritan. And what he's about to say goes directly against everything he was raised to believe. So take us back to your upbringing. What did you discover that made you realize that you might have been lied to all along?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Daniel, for having me on and for welcoming me onto your channel. To answer your question, there were many instances in my life where the narrative, so to speak, began to show its holes to me. I remember one time, whenever I would just ask basic questions, for example, about my people, I wouldn't get these definitive answers that I was looking for, things that I can really grasp onto, that I can be proud of, tangible things that I could really showcase to others about the Palestinian heritage and such. For example, I would ask my family about basic questions, like about our family name. Our family name has a bit of an interesting meaning to it. I won't share it here for obvious reasons, but I would ask, what's the origin of this name? And I would get a folk tale, and I'm not exaggerating. Admittedly so, my family would just share, they would say something like, well, the story goes is that some ancestor of ours had something happen to them and yada, yada, yada. Or I would ask another question a basic question about the name of our village, which also has a unique name to it. And again, I would get kind of a bit of folklore. So I remember that being very discouraging growing up, because if I was to be this unapologetic fighter for the Palestinian cause, I was hoping for something real, something rich, and something much more meaningful. I didn't know what it was I was looking for, but it wasn't these superficial explanations of our identity.
Now, growing up, what were you taught about Israel in certain simple terms about Jews?
Yeah, well, everything I was taught about Israel and how Israel formed was that it was violent and illegal. It was the ultimate story of betrayal, where you've probably heard of this, where it's the kind and gracious Arabs welcoming the Jewish people, these refugees, into our land, as we would say. And instead of having nice neighbors, gracious neighbors, they put a knife in our back and they began to steal our land. That's more or less the story that I would hear growing up. And it was easy. It's important to take note that it's easy to believe these things about the Jewish people as a Muslim, because as a Muslim, you're already raised with a very uh, negative perspective of Jews. And this is taught from the Hadith, and this is taught from the Quran. And so when it comes to learning, when it comes to the lies about Israel and about the Jewish people, it's very easy to just absorb it all as truth, because in your mind, why would you put it past to them? In the Quran, the Jews are described as cowards, they're described as deceivers, they're described as those who rebel against God himself and kill their prophets. So when you're told that these same people then stole your land and have committed apparently these atrocities, it's easy to believe.
Now, were you ever allowed to question that?
Yeah. Um well, no. When I say yes, it's we can do what we want. It's just whether or not we're willing to take on the consequences. So, short answer, no. I was not allowed to question these things. I remember when I began to, I was immediately rebuked, and I had even been threatened a couple times in my life. And I started small. I would just post a couple things on Facebook, asking simple questions like, who here believes in a two-state solution? And I would immediately get a flood of comments from friends and family in the comments below the post, and 100% of them would say, we don't believe in a two-state solution. And why would I even ask that? I remember even one time I was a bit more bold, and I made a public post on Facebook asking, hey, if there are any pro-Israelis that would like to sit down and have a coffee with me, I'd like to take you out for some coffee. This is an invite to argue. I really just want to begin dialogue, start conversing. And immediately, of course, I was rebuked by all of my fellow peers and, of course, my relatives, just in the comment section, immediately rebuking me for even suggesting such a thing. And this isn't a one-off thing. This is the status quo among most, if not all, Palestinian families.
Could you take us through the timeline? At what age did you question all of this? Just so we can get a picture of how long it's been.
Sure. So I would say I began to explore the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more since 2018. So it's been more or less 8 years. So just so that everyone knows, this isn't an overnight thing. And it probably is not going to look like anything that your viewers would imagine it be. It's not like I just flipped the switch one night and I got it. It was very gradual, and I very much was still regurgitating Palestinian narratives and anti-Israel narratives up until even very recently. And that's just how that process goes. So I would say 2018 is when I began to delve into it. I had even I had trouble whether I want to share this, but I had even gone to Judea Samaria, and I lived there for a time because I was so invested in this cause, because I wanted to seek the answer to the conflict. And that's how committed I was to really trying to understand it and approaching it in a new way, only because I began to see that the way that we have been doing it, it just has led us nowhere and has kept us stuck and bitter and miserable. And I wanted to see a way out for my community.
So you, out of everybody else, like it affected you so much so that you decided that you want to do something about it when everybody around you would just kind of take in the information and just, you know, run with it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It was and you have to understand, and it's not even among only the Muslim Palestinians. I've had conversations with Christian Palestinians. Same conversation. It goes both ways, which is a phenomenon I'm still trying to understand myself. Because it is truly insane to me how a Christian, especially a Middle Eastern Christian, who I'm sure more than other Christians has some sort of reference to what history has been like under Muslim rule, would still go to bat for the Palestinian cause. However, just to kind of bring back to the comment, yes, whether I was having kind of conversations with Palestinian Muslims or Christians, any time that I would try and suggest anything other than violent resistance, it was immediately put down and discouraged, from a simple argument all the way up to being threatened to be kicked out of Judea Samaria if I ever said anything like this again.
Now, at what point did you leave Islam and convert to Christianity?
I left Islam in 2019 and I converted to Christianity in 2020. about middle of 2020, around summertime. It's a long story. However, what led me out of Islam, if you wanted to boil it down to a couple sentences, is I began to investigate the life of Muhammad, the founder of Islam, their prophet Muhammad, and I was face to face with a man that I wouldn't want even around my own children or my home. This was a carnal man, not a holy man, and it didn't make any sense to me that a holy and righteous God would send an unholy and sinful man to be our example, to be our pattern of conduct to follow. Practically, in my mind, that didn't make any sense. And spiritually, even, why would I count on this man and his teachings? Why would I rely on this for my eternal life?
Now, you were raised in America, but taught to see yourself as a Palestinian first. Why was that?
You know, growing up in the US or any Western country for that matter with a Palestinian Muslim identity is bound to create a life of inner turmoil. I know this from my own personal experience and even speaking to other Palestinians who are either still in the Muslim faith or have left the Muslim faith. It's a key characteristic of the Palestinian community or any Muslim community, but especially the Palestinian community, to hold extreme and even hostile views against the Western world. And so when you're born and raised in the United States, like I was, and you're told to reject the American identity, you're encouraged to just put it away altogether. You're told that you're only a Palestinian. And through the behaviors of your community, you see that it is just our way of not integrating and that we remain within our own communities. It creates a real internal conflict with me, at least. All my life, I've fought between two lives, two identities. The one where I felt it was my more true self, that I enjoyed my life here in the United States. I felt more at home here with my fellow citizens, the friends I was making at school, the overall way of life. So that there's that side of me. And then there's the other side of me where I wanted to still maintain my status in my community. I wanted to maintain my relationships with my family. I wanted to please them. And so there was that side of me. And those two sides were constantly warring with one another. And it really creates a bit of an identity crisis, uh, is what I'll say. That's how it's like growing up in the United States, as really lots of Muslims, but especially the Palestinian Muslims.
So, in general, would you say that Muslims live in the West, but they still see, Americans as outsiders, or even in Europe, they can live in England, but they see the English people as outsiders? And do you think that that's the reason why there is problems, division between the groups?
I had spoken about this with Michael Gamal, who you had on your podcast a couple weeks ago, and we were both just reflecting on the fact that, yeah, when we were younger, we would hear our own elders, our community, call our fellow American citizens ajnabi, which means foreigners. So we're in the country of the United States, and we're looking at fellow American citizens and calling them foreigners. That's how much they would see their neighbors as outsiders. Now, I'm not going to say that every Muslim household is like this. I've met many Muslim households growing up who really made the effort to assimilate and to integrate and did a very good job of doing it. But funny enough, those would be the same Muslim family homes that my family wouldn't really interact with. And if they did, it was on a very minimal basis. So I would say it's at least within the city that I grew up in most of my life. I would say most of the Muslim communities, most of the Muslim households saw themselves in that way. And you have to add on to that many of these households, including mine, they had this goal that they would one day move back to the West Bank. to Judea Samaria. With my parents, especially, I remember when I was younger, they made that clear that, your father and I, we moved here when we were younger, just before we got married. We had you, but the plan is always to move back. We're here just to make some money, send it back home for your grandparents, and to one day build a home, and we're out of here. And so that adds to that internal conflict that I was talking about earlier, where although I was enjoying my life here in the United States, in the back of my mind, I always had this inkling, this sense that this wasn't permanent, that this all may go away, that one day I may get the news from my parents, hey, the house in the West Bank is done. Betna fi bledna, it's all done and finished, and we're gonna move.
So your family, like you mentioned, is from Samaria. What does the world misunderstand about that region when people say occupation? Does that match reality?
If you had spoken to me about 10 years ago, I would have said yes, absolutely, it is an occupation. However, when you compare what's going on currently in Judea Samaria to what the actual definition of occupation is, there is no occupation. The West Bank, at best, is a disputed territory. Um, However, I know many who would argue that no, it belongs to Israel fully because it's a land that was fought for in the War of Independence of 48, and Israel immediately under their own, if I'm not mistaken, under their authority gave the West Bank, Judea Samaria to Jordan. Is that correct? And then
Yes.
Gaza was annexed or at least under Egyptian rule. And there was no pre-existing Palestinian country or Palestinian state. Now, if there was, then maybe the argument can be made that there is an occupation. However, before Israel, it was the British Mandate. Before the British Mandate, it was the Ottoman Empire, and you could keep going back. You're not going to find a Palestinian state, an independent, sovereign nation, a people called the Palestinians who had their borders. I remember growing up, I had on my iPod Touch on the home screen, uh, that famous map that you see lots of pro-Palestinians use, where it shows what Palestine looked like in 1947, and then what it looked like in 1948, and then in 67, and then modern day. I always had that on my phone as a way to quickly show people. Well, what I'm falsely admitting there is that that map in 47 was Palestine, as if we were a people who had these exact borders and we were sovereign and we were then occupied by a foreign entity. And the narrative would always sound that way. Even the story that I told earlier, you had asked me, what did you learn about Israel? And I told you how I learned that it was a story of betrayal and that we, the Palestinians, the Jewish people, into our land, as if we were some governing body that had the power to allow in refugees and give them refuge. And this was our land, as if this was our jurisdiction. All of this is pointing to a sovereign, independent state that never existed. And so people need to keep that in mind, that when you say occupation, you're detached from reality. Because first you would need to tell me when the Palestinian state was established, who is our first president or our first king, our first monarch, whatever. Once you're able to establish that for me, then maybe we can go on and continue the conversation on whether there was or is currently an occupation.
Why do you think so many people still think that this is a conflict about land? We speak about two-state solutions and things like that. When you hear from the other side, when they're chanting from the river to the sea, that there's something deeper over here.
I would say that we're, unfortunately, and I don't say this, of course, with any amusement or pride, my people are really good con artists. They're really great at propaganda. They're really great at playing the victim. And it's enabled by the surrounding Arab countries and Muslim countries. And increasingly so, it's being supported and enabled by even Western countries in the modern day, as we're seeing, especially in Europe, but even increasingly so here in the United States. I think that's the easy, more secular way of going about a very complex conflict, is to just boil it down to matters of land. However, if you look at it more deeply, and it doesn't take much to look into, just listen to the chants that you're hearing at the protest. خيبر خيبر يا يهود. من المية للمية فلسطين عربية. From the river to the sea, Palestine is for the Arabs. This is very much a Islamic supremacist cause. And that is the fuel behind this conflict, is a religious cause.
Now, you said something powerful in the interview that you did with Michael Gamal. You said that you didn't just change your beliefs, you lost your identity. And I guess you struggled with that. What did that feel like?
Yeah. I Yeah, in that podcast I expressed how leaving Islam was very difficult. I mean, imagine just believing something that you know is the truth all your life, only for you to find out that it's completely false and made up and just stands on pillars of sand. And when I say believe, I mean like the sky is blue, you believe the sky is blue, and then one day you're told and proven that it's in fact not blue. That's how hard it was for me when I discovered that Islam was false. However, as hard as that was, it pales into comparison as to what I went through after October 7th. After October 7th, it really forced me to face my people head on once again. I think for a few years before that, I had put aside my Palestinian identity, put aside the Palestinian conflict, Israeli conflict altogether, because I wanted to focus more on my new found faith in the Christian religion. And I wanted to build my faith up in that. And I didn't want to be distracted by these more worldly, what I thought to be more secular conflicts. And so October 7th was an event, a tragic event that plunged me back into that world. And I wish I could tell you and your viewers here that after October 7th, I woke up. I woke up and I realized, wow, my people are in the wrong. We have done this to ourselves, and we lay in the bed that we make. However, that isn't at all how it went. That internal warring conflict that I had grown up with all my life resurfaced. The anti-Semitism that was baked into me that I thought I had put away when I accepted the Christian faith resurfaced. And I think what saved me is my new worldview, my new Christian worldview, is that I knew what I was doing was wrong. I think even Michael Gamal in the podcast that you had with him mentioned it, that he converted for a little while to Islam, and Islam was kind of a way, an ideal, to support his anti-Semitism, to support the Palestinian cause. So imagine the inverse of that. I'm now a Christian, and all this anti-Semitism is resurfacing, but now I know it's wrong because I know who my Lord and Savior is. I know who the children of Israel are. I know who the Jewish people really are. Why do I have this hatred and this animosity in me? And so I prayed about it. I really prayed because it was a trying time for me. You asked about what it was like when that identity began to collapse. I could only describe it to you and just what my life was like during those couple months in the month of October, November, even into December. It was spent with a lot of times on my knees, crying. It was spent in bed, not being able to get out of bed. And I really couldn't function for myself or for my family because it was as if God was just putting me through a trial, through the fire, to finally put to rest this warring identities that I've had all my life. And I really had to face it head on this time instead of cowering away from it and running away from it and kind of putting it back to the back burner. And so I prayed, and I guess God knows the way my mind works. I need to see things in a practical sense. I need to understand the history of things. I think that's why I was so disappointed when I would ask my family, my parents, about these basic questions about my people, about our history, and I wouldn't get much of an answer. It was disappointing because I'm very inquisitive. I need to understand why it is that we believe what we believe. And so God knew that. And so one of the ways that he answered my prayer to help me, one, purge this anti-Semitism, and two, finally help me with this confusion that I have regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was to begin pointing me to people who were much more knowledgeable than I am in that field. And so slowly but surely, I began to run into on social media different figures, different people. For example, like Nick Matau or Dal Oran or Sahar TV. You know, I think I don't think people downplay. I think people need to hype it up more. These figures, this type of work is extremely valuable because I mean it when I say that without God leading me to find these people, to listen to what they had to say, I don't know where I would be in today's age, where I would be in regards to what my identity is. It really takes people outside of you, outside of your community, to confront you with your beliefs and with your presuppositions and for you to be able to wake up. And so, although the identity collapse was coming in, I found refuge, one, in the fact that I am a child of God in this faith of Christianity. And two, I found refuge in dispelling all the myths and the lies that I have been told all my life. And when the Lord helped me get grasp of those two things, and I'm still getting grasp of them to this day. I'm still very much on a still on a learning basis here. I'm in no way a teacher here. I'm still learning. I'm still figuring my way out around here. Um, but yeah, that's how I was able to cope with that identity loss.
What exactly did you feel about Palestinians before October 7th? And how do you feel about them today?
Before October 7th, I saw my people, and when I say before October 7th, I mean even before 2018. Because, like I had mentioned before, 2018 is kind of when I began to seek a different route on this Palestinian Israeli conflict. And so when I was younger, I grew up just believing that we Palestinians are victims, that we've really been just given no other choice but to resist with violence. That's what I was made to believe. However, like I had mentioned before, when I went and lived in Judea and Samaria for a time, I came face to face with the reality of who my people were, by and large. So I'm sure we can find individual Palestinians who truly just want to seek peace. They don't even necessarily need to like Israel, but they just want to be left alone. They want to raise their children. They want to have a good life. I'm sure we can find those individuals. However, by and large, the culture, what you find is systemic in this community, is a people that will not be content until the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people. That is what I saw when I lived amongst my family there in Judea and Samaria. I was confronted with it over and over, and I tried to make excuses for it in my head. For example, I remember I was just with one of my cousins, and one of his friends was there, and Hitler came up. Just the man Hitler came up, and he was just telling me straight to my face, Hitler is my hero. I love that man. He did a good thing. I have a photo of him on my wall. And then later on, I'll talk to my uncle, and the Holocaust would come up, and he would say, well, el Yahud, the Jews, they began to start problems there in Germany. And so, Hitler just had to take care of it. And I would hear these extreme, even for me, still growing up in a Palestinian community, but in the United States, this was just vile to me. And then I would see all the murals of all these martyrs all over our village, or when we would visit Bethlehem, and there would be murals of Palestinian martyrs all over. And I would ask the people that I'm with, "Oh, can you tell me the story behind this man? Can you tell me the story behind this little boy?" And they would tell me what happened up to the day that they were killed or they were martyred, so to speak. And it would be the result of very violent acts. It would be this man here, he snuck into Jerusalem and he stole the gun of one of the IDF soldiers and mowed a couple people down. And yeah, he was killed. And so here's his mural for us to celebrate and for us to honor him. What do you make of that? What do you make of that as someone who grew up in the Western world, who heard martyrdom being described in a very different manner? When I learned about martyrdom in schools, I would learn about, Christians losing their lives over their faith, simply for their faith. They weren't violent and then had a response of violence and then were killed. And so it's a completely different world when you're there. Words have different meanings. I remember this one time I was I was just walking around and I hear a helicopter beginning to circle over our village and then go to the village next door. And then they went to one of the nearby settlements. It looked like they were on a search. And I began to ask around, like, hey, what happened? And they told me, well, one of our brothers, one of our Palestinian brothers, went into, I think it was Jerusalem. This was like, I want to say this was beginning of 2019. And he took his knife, he stabbed a soldier, took his assault rifle, went to a nearby bus, and mowed everyone down in there. And now the IDF, they're searching for him. And they would tell me in a snarky manner, but don't worry, we're gonna do a good job of hiding him. Or, well, that village that he's from, they're gonna try and hide him and keep him safe. Over and over, I was faced with the reality of who my people were. And I began to become increasingly discouraged about my people and for my people.
Now, you took a DNA test and it changed everything for you. What did you discover exactly?
So I discovered that I have little to no ties to the Arab people, which goes against everything that I had ever known about myself. All my life, whenever I would introduce myself to people, I would say, I'm an Arab. I would rarely say that I'm Middle Eastern. I would just say, I'm an Arab. I'm a Palestinian Arab. And come to find out, my people uh, have very little ties to the Arabian Peninsula, which it all makes sense in hindsight. They say hindsight is 2020. However, when you're in the thick of it, you don't really connect the dots. We make the argument that we're the indigenous people to the land. And while that may not be true for many Palestinians because they are here as a result of immigration and migration from other regions of the Middle East, there are some Palestinian communities that have been there, that have roots in this land. And if it's not in this land, it may be a little north, like they're Phoenician, or it may be a little more to the east in Jordan and Syria. Very strong ties to the Levant. And so it forced me to really rethink what all of this meant. Um, because what this tells me, and if I'm drawing the dots correctly, is that if my people are in fact indigenous to the Levant and have been here in the Samaria region for centuries, and if this DNA test is correct in showing me that I have almost no ties to the Arab people, then what this tells me is that my people weren't always Arabs and my people weren't always Muslims. And if you look into the history of this, that all makes sense because the Pan-Arabism, the Islamic conquest, didn't start until after the death of Prophet Muhammad in about the 7th century. And that's when the first and second caliphs made their way up to the Levant and conquered that region. And just like they did with every other region they conquered, they forced the people to abandon their language, abandon their identity, to adopt the language of Arabic, to be their new mother tongue, and force conversions into Islam. And so I don't know what the story really of my people are. When I have the name the Saved Samaritan right there, it's more of an ode and it's more of a good estimate. My village comes about 12 to 13 miles south of Mount Gerizim, which is the holy mountain for the Samaritans, and it's about 20 miles away from Jerusalem, the holy place for the Jewish people. And so what this tells me is that my people could have been either Jewish or Samaritan or even Phoenician or even a little bit of Syrian because I have a bit of it says I'm tied to Syrian and more specifically Syrian Jews. And so this flips my whole world upside down. And it becomes very tragic when you understand the implications of it. Because what this could mean is that I have very strong ties to the Jewish people, and yet I have been made to believe that they are my enemy, and I have been made to believe that they are my oppressors, and I have been made to believe that I need to fight them to the death. And it's such a tragic story of Jewish families, Jewish tribes, Samaritan tribes being separated and colonized, and then centuries later being formed into enemies to fight them. It's really all awful.
You said something very powerful. You said a tiny part of your ancestry ended up controlling your whole identity. Can you
Mhm.
explain that?
Yeah. Here, I'll bring up that photo to help better explain it. So what we had done is we uploaded the raw DNA to my true ancestry. And what it did is it formed this chart, among other charts, this chart was especially important to me because it really gave me a visual of what I mean when I say this small portion of my ancestry has really colonized and controlled my life. So this photo here, this shows all of the people groups and tribes and kingdoms that my ancestors were a part of. And if you zoom in, you would think that if I was an Arab, that this big brown chunk right here would be what I would zoom into and say, yep, right there, I'm connected to the Arab people. However, if I wanted to show you how I'm connected to the Arab people, I would have to actually zoom in pretty far in, and I would show you this dark brown line right there. And that dark brown line represents the Umayyad Caliphate. And the Umayyad Caliphate was, I believe it was the second caliphate that ruled over the Levant. Of course, among other regions, they were one of the biggest caliphate empire. And that's all I have. I mean, everything else on this list has nothing to do with the Arab people. This big chunk right here, this is the Semitic people in the Levant, the Canaan region. This big kind of yellow beige chunk right here, that is Phoenicians. And then after that, it goes to the Amorites and the Arameans and the Hittites, and that's my ancestral core is the Semitic people. And so when I tell people that the Arab identity, the Muslim identity, has colonized this is such a small portion of what my people were, but and has yet had the power to completely overturn the rest of what I had just shown you, and has completely subjugated my people into being fighters for an Islamic cause. That's what I mean. It's and it's truly sad because we see this happening all over in Iraq, in Egypt, in Syria. People who were not Arabs, who were not Muslims, being homogenized. under one rule, and the implications of that we see to this day, especially in relation to how they treat their fellow Jewish neighbors.
Do you think that many Palestinians would find the same thing if they looked into their DNA? I've heard several cases of this myself.
I have two. I've I've heard of a few Palestinians who have done a DNA test, or at least they were like half Palestinian, half Egyptian, and they do find that they have lots of roots to the Jewish people. What I've been hearing more of, though, is one of my close Jewish friends that I've made. She's been telling me these stories because she speaks to a lot of these uh, ex-Muslims from the Levant region who are trying to discover their roots and such. And more often than not, she's saying that the story she's finding is that these individuals will discover, right, just like I did, these ancestral roots in the Semitic people and the Jewish people. And they would go to their family and present it to them, like, what, look at this. Or they would find they would find a letter or an old photo of a Jewish woman, and it turns out it's their great grandmother or what have you. And they'd report this to their family to see, like, well, what do you think of this? Did you know this? And unfortunately, a lot of the response is more or less, oh yes, we knew, and we knew that we were once Jewish, but thank God, by Allah's mercy, He saved us, and we are no longer Jewish. We are Muslims. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we find out that many families are actually aware, especially the older generations, are actually aware of their ties to the Samaritan people or to the Jewish people. However, they, for one reason or the other, more likely because of their Islamic faith, have just shoved it under the rug and have completely accepted their identity as a Muslim or as an Arab.
Why do you think it is that Americans support something that they don't fully understand when it comes to Islam? For example, you see people in the West that are trying to protect the Iranian regime. Um, we saw a lot of protests for Palestine, but not for the Iranians that were being slaughtered by their own government. Um, why do you think people are confused about this?
They lack the understanding that Islam is very much a political ideology. They're accustomed to the West, where, thank God, we separate religion and state, church and state, at least for the most part. We keep these things separate. We don't accept a theocracy here in the West. And they believe that the rest of the world is the same way. However, this is far from the truth. Islam, from its foundation, was always meant to be a dominating force. You look at the Sunnah, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, as early as his Meccan days, supposedly when he was more peaceful and there wasn't as much violence going on. Even then, although outwardly he would be portraying a message of coexistence, lakum dinukum waliya din, you have your religion, I'll have mine, this sort of coexistence type of message. He would express that outwardly. When he was in private meetings with his fellow tribesmen, he would show his true colors and his true intentions. And you would find this in the history of At-Tabari. I forget which page it was. I think it was page 98, or I can give you the source later, where you find the Meccan people, the Quraysh tribe, approaching Muhammad, who has been ridiculing their gods and has just really caused turmoil and division in Mecca. And they're coming to him offering peace, offering truce, trying to find a way where they can move on from this. And Muhammad's response is not accepting it. There was peace on the table, and he pushed it away. And his response was, I invite you to utter a saying, which is, you later find out, is La ilaha illallah, which is, there is no God but Allah. And this saying will help you rule over the Arabs and the non-Arabs. So Muhammad very clearly is invoking a religious phrase, La ilaha illallah, and is saying that this saying, that there is no God but Allah, will grant you the power to rule over the Arabs and non-Arabs. So it is a political force. So from its inception, we see Muhammad had always had this intention of using Islam, using this faith in God, in one God, as a way to rule, as a way to dominate. And this is what the Western world needs to understand, is that Islam will always be a theocratic political ideology. It has never once gone through some major reformation like what we see Christianity has done, or even Judaism. Islam hasn't gone through any type of reformation. The same calling, the same message of expansion, of imperialism that we find in the Sunnah and we find in the Quran is the same message that we find today. And this is a very vital key element of this whole conflict that we're finding ourselves in today, which is the Islamization of the Western world, like we're seeing, unfortunately, in Europe and the UK. And we're allowing ourselves to be invaded. Some people would call it a soft invasion, because we don't want to call a spade a spade, where we fear the names of Islamophobia. And so, to not rock the boat, we're going to pretend, or at least be ignorant of the fact that Islam is not here to assimilate and to coexist.
You're on social media. What is your goal with your social media page, and what is some, feedback that you've received along the way?
Mhm. So if you go to my pages, whether it be Instagram or TikTok, the Saved Samaritan, you'll find at the top my pinned posts, and there you'll see I've listed who am I, what's my mission, and my guiding principles. And under what's my mission, I list my 3 objectives. And the first one is to witness to Muslims. I really feel that since God has called me out of this community, He has now given me the task of becoming a bridge of sorts to that community, to invite them to a better faith. And so that is my first objective, is to witness to Muslims. My second objective is to disillusion Palestinians. And I know that this is the most hotly controversial and hotly debated objective of mine, but I really do truly, I've been increasingly more passionate about this one. I actually started my page more so to be more of a ministry of sorts. However, I've come to realize that I'm more needed in this field of the Jewish advocacy, Israel advocacy, helping my community, the Palestinian community, overcome their radicalized ways and to de-radicalize and to disillusion. This has been this has been something that I've been struggling with more recently, because I told a friend of mine this recently, where, if you see that I do very well in comparing the theologies of Islam and Christianity, and I do well in really forming the arguments and the debates for the Christian faith versus the Islamic faith, don't give me the credit, because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. People much greater than I before me, including David Wood, who you just had on your podcast recently, they've already had all of this fleshed out, even from centuries ago. St. John of Damascus, church giants who have already done the hard work for us and trailblazed the way of knowing how to witness to Muslims and how to call them to the God of Abraham, the true God of Abraham. And so if you see me doing very well in these fields, it's because I've already learned from people who are greater than I and more knowledgeable than I am. However, when it comes to that second objective of mine, which is to disillusion the Palestinians and to help advocate for the Jewish people and their right to their homeland and their own Jewish state, and what and how I relate to that as someone who's just now recently figuring out that they may have very strong Jewish ties and Jewish ancestry. I'm really still trying to figure all of this out. And so I actually plead with your viewers to really pray for me, because there isn't really any giants that I could stand on to learn from. It really feels, and I don't say this to gain any sympathy or to bring any light or attention to me, but it really feels like I, amongst maybe very few people, are pioneering something new here. And just like with any pioneers, it's going to have lots of hurdles and lots of obstacles on the way. And so I'm trying to navigate all that. And so, sorry, I kind of trailed off from your question, but these are my objectives. And of course, the third objective is to warn the West of the Islamization. I really do believe it's a real threat that we need to keep our eye on and to be proactive about.
Saved Samaritan, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, really am touched by your story, and I have been enlightened by this conversation. If there is a final message that you can give us, perhaps there are other people that are thinking to follow your path. I know it's not easy to do what you did. What would you tell those people?
I think I would put out a call to action, like an action item, something that people can actually act on. First, being to the Jewish people. I want to say, one, I'm very grateful for you and grateful for all of the Jewish friends that I've made over these last few months. You all have been holding my hand and gently guiding me as I grow in my understanding of all of this. And I want to, if I could ask you guys of anything, it would be to extend that grace that you have been given to me, extend that grace to others who are beginning to see the light. Because I'm telling you now, Daniel, there are many. I get messages probably every week of Palestinians, of ex Muslims who are coming to terms of this new understanding. And it may not look anything or sound like anything that I'm saying. In their own way, they're going through that process. Extend that grace to them and help them because they need it. Like you said, Daniel, this isn't easy. This is extremely hard. It's very lonely too. And so one thing that I've seen that the Jewish people are good at is really being that family that these people need. So to especially those Palestinians out there who may be listening to this, I would ask them to reach out to certain individuals on social media or certain friends, even in real life, if there are Jewish people who can help bring some answers that you may need or that you just need someone to confide in. Don't be afraid of the Jewish people. They're nothing like what we've been told all our lives. And my second thing that I want to say is to the Christian world, especially to the Middle Eastern Christians. I want to say this as a warning. We as Christians should not have any role in the Palestinian cause. Why? Because this Palestinian cause is very much a religious cause. To the Muslim world, this is just one of many projects under their holy war. And if we are to be good Christians, we shouldn't be involved in this holy war of a false god. And so I would call these Christians out to reflect on their stance on the Israeli Palestinian conflict and to take a second look, like I did. And I know that I'm asking a lot of you because I understand it's hard. However, it's needed because I implore you to withdraw from this demonic and satanic cause because that's what it is. It is of the devil. I've been having these discussions with other people, and this really feels demonic. The influx of anti-Semitism that we've been seeing. And as someone who's read the Gospels and who has listened to the words of Jesus Christ, I'm just calling on the Christians of the world, as well, especially the Middle Eastern Christians who have that understanding of their history under Muslim rule, to please self-reflect and take a second look at this cause and really see, is this something that I, as a son of God or a daughter of God, should be participating in?
Well, thank you so much for your important words. Thank you again for joining me, and I hope to be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
If you have a 401k or an IRA, please listen. Gold is at record highs. What many people don't know is this: you can move part of your retirement money legally and without tax penalties into physical gold you actually own. Alpha Omega Gold helps you do this through a gold IRA. Your gold is real, it is stored safely, it is in your name. Learn more at ao.gold/stand. Alpha Omega Gold is our sponsor, and they proudly stand with Israel.